I'd like to try a series of tutorials to help you outside of class understand the things that we're doing in class and help you prepare so that we can all move forward together next time. So today in this tutorial I'd like to talk about CSS and give you an introduction. To start off, you need to know what a rule is. Now that you understand what an HTML element is, you need to understand what a CSS rule is. In CSS, instead of writing elements, we write rules. And rules are made of three things: a selector, like this H1, a property, like margin, and a value. In this case, it's 0. So I could say, this is the selector. I could say, this is the property, and this is the value. And I could put any selector here that I want, any property here that I want, and any value here that I want. Notice that the property and its values always are found inside of curly brackets. Notice also that there's always a colon separating the property and its value, and that there's always a semicolon at the end of this property value statement. Let's start off then. Now that you understand what a rule is, let's talk about what a selector is. Selectors allow you to target specific things in HTML. So if in my HTML document I have headings, like an H1 and maybe an H2, I could say I want all of my H1s and H2s to have the color property of white. Or I could also write that of white. So these are called HTML selectors. And there's three other kinds of selectors I want to talk to you about. But you know the HTML tags, so it would make just as much sense to say H1, P, LI, body. Those are all HTML tags that you should be familiar with. Another kind of selector requires that in my HTML I not only indicate that there's a heading, but I would also indicate that that heading has a class or an ID. Now, we actually talked about classes and IDs before. Let me show you in our notes. If I can find it. It's on the Introduction to XHTML, letter D, a few helpful attributes. ID is one of those, used for anchors and elements that exist only once per document. And then a class, used when there is more than one element that needs the same class association. So let me write you an example. Let's suppose that in my HTML I have a H1 tag, and well, let's use an H2 tag. Let's say I have an H2 tag with a subtitle in it. But let's say that this subtitle is a special kind of a subtitle. That this subtitle I use only in my footer. So I might say that this H2 has an ID of footer. Or let's say that there are 3 or 4 articles on this page, and each of the articles, I want the H2 headings to look different, and so I'm going to class these as, let's see, article. Okay, so there's an example of class and an ID. I'll leave this one up because you need to understand that somehow I need CSS to see, to know, and target this, the H2s that are classed article. So what I would do in my CSS is I would say H2 dot article. That means all H2 tags that are classed article should be this color. If this were an ID, then I would say all H2 tags that are ID'd article are this color. So IDs use the pound sign and classes use the period. Let's say that I've got not only H2s that have the ID of article, but what if I have paragraphs that have the ID of article? I probably wouldn't do that because there should really be only one ID called article on each page. So let's use this example. Let's use class in this example. So I have headings that are classed article and paragraphs that are classed article. And if I want them all to be the same color, then instead of saying h2.article, comma p.article, whoops, I could just say dot article. Then anything with this class would be, the text would be given this color. Okay, so that's an introduction to HTML tags or HTML selectors like H1, class selectors like this, and ID selectors like this. And I'm just making these words up. You can use any word that you want, really, as long as you tell it in the HTML what that class or that ID is called. Now, there's another kind of selector called the universal selector, and you use the asterisk for the universal selector, and that means give everything in the linked documents, give it all this color, all the text this color. The thing I like about universal selectors is that I can easily override browser styles that are built in that make my page style in a certain way without me controlling it. For example, the margins and the padding are always set, and in every browser they're just a little bit different. So I like to style my margins and my paddings universally. Whoops, I need a semicolon there. I like to style them universally using this universal selector. Here's another example, or another kind of selector. It's called a pseudo selector, and I can use it to style things that aren't classes or IDs or HTML tags or universals. So for example, if I want to style all of my links so that when I hover over them, they have a certain, let's just use color again, then I would use this colon to indicate the pseudo class or the pseudo selector. And what that means is that, and there are several of these pseudo selectors that I can use. I can use one called first. I can use one called last, I think. I can use one called visited. So I can style things that I couldn't catch with classes, IDs, and HTML. Okay, so there's an introduction to selectors. And if this doesn't make sense, you can always look at the notes. I'm just trying to cover here let's see, on the CSS introduction, rules and selectors. In the next tutorial, I want to pull this introduction into a real-life example.